It's 6 a.m. on May 27th, 2015, at the Lac Hotel in Zurich, one of the most expensive hotels in Switzerland. Swiss police are moving through marble hallways. They aren't checking in, they're arresting FIFA officials in dawn raids. The FBI has been building this case for years.
Swiss authorities raided FIFA headquarters and arrested 7 senior officials accused of accepting over $100 million in bribes.
By the end of the morning, 14 officials are indicted for racketeering, wire fraud, and money laundering, tied to over $150 million in bribes, and investigators would later call it not a scandal, but a business model.
It's not good in terms of image.
Because FIFA is a registered non-profit organization, yet it generates over $7.5 billion in a single World Cup cycle, with projections reaching $13 billion. So, how did a football association become one of the most powerful financial machines in sports history while operating as a non-profit? To understand how FIFA got here, you have to go back to where it almost didn't. In 1928, FIFA was on the verge of collapse. The organization had been founded in Paris in 1904, with just 7 European nations around a table. By the late 1920s, it had grown slightly, but it was still largely irrelevant. The Olympics held the football tournament. FIFA held meetings. Jules Rimet, the French lawyer who was FIFA's president at the time, understood something critical. Without a flagship event that FIFA owned and controlled entirely, the organization would always be a bureaucratic footnote. It needed leverage. It needed something that couldn't exist without it. So, in 1930, FIFA launched the World Cup. The first tournament was held in Uruguay, a politically complicated choice that split European nations, with most refusing to travel because of the cost and the distance. Only 13 nations entered. Crowds were modest. Press coverage outside South America was minimal. But Rimet had planted something, a seed that would take decades to germinate. But when it did, it would change sport, television, and global commerce forever. The key insight, the one that would define everything that followed, was that the World Cup wasn't just a football tournament. It was a globally distributed media event that FIFA controlled entirely. Every broadcast, every photograph, every ticket sold, every sponsorship deal. The rights didn't belong to clubs. They didn't belong to leagues. They didn't even belong to the players on the pitch. They belonged to FIFA. That ownership structure, locked in during the humblest beginnings of international football, became the legal foundation of a $13 billion empire. For 40 years, FIFA remained a European gentleman's club, polite, conservative, small. The World Cup grew in profile after 1950 and exploded in global consciousness after 1966, but the organization's commercial potential was almost completely untapped. No major sponsors, no meaningful broadcast deals. The entire FIFA operation ran on modest entry fees and goodwill. Then, in 1974, a 58-year-old Brazilian sports administrator named João Havelange walked into a FIFA election and rewrote every rule. Havelange ran what sports historians have called one of the most sophisticated political campaigns in the history of international organizations. He spent 2 years traveling to Africa, Asia, and Latin America, regions that had seats in FIFA but no real power, and made promises: more World Cup spots, more development funding, more representation. He offered developing nations something the European establishment had never bothered to: respect. He won the presidency 68 votes to 52. The Europeans were stunned, but Havelange had a problem. He had made massive promises: expand the World Cup from 16 to 24 teams, create youth tournaments, fund football development global, and FIFA had almost no money to deliver on any of them. So he did something that transformed not just FIFA, but modern sports business entirely. He sold it. Havelange turned to Horst Dassler, the son of Adidas founder Adi Dassler, who had quietly been building a sports marketing empire from the shadows. Dassler understood something almost nobody else in sport had grasped. The World Cup wasn't a football tournament. It was a global advertising platform, and it was being given away for free. Together, they engineered the commercialization of the World Cup. Adidas, Coca-Cola, and a handful of other multinational brands became official FIFA partners, paying significant fees to attach their logos to the most watched event on the planet. It was a simple idea, but in 1976, it was revolutionary. FIFA suddenly had money. Havelange delivered on his promises. The World Cup expanded, new tournaments were created, and a template was established, one that the organization would refine, scale, and eventually corrupt for the next 5 decades. The sponsorship model was transformative, but the real engine of FIFA's wealth wasn't brand logos, it was television. The 1970 World Cup in Mexico was the first to be broadcast in color. Viewing figures were unlike anything sport had seen before. By 1982, roughly 1 billion people were watching the World Cup. By 1994, that number had climbed to an estimated 2.1 billion across the tournament. FIFA's leadership grasped what this meant with remarkable speed. They didn't just sell broadcast rights. They restructured them, bundled them, and turned them into long-term packages that guaranteed revenue regardless of which teams qualified or how entertaining the matches were. By the time Sepp Blatter took over from Havelange in 1998, after serving as FIFA General Secretary for 23 years, learning every single lever of the machine, the World Cup broadcast rights were generating hundreds of millions per tournament. Blatter pushed further. He centralized rights. He created exclusive long-term deals. He moved broadcasts to free-to-air in developing markets to maximize reach, and to pay television in wealthy markets to maximize revenue. The 2002 World Cup in South Korea and Japan generated $1.3 billion in broadcast rights alone. By 2014 in Brazil, that number had nearly tripled. For Qatar 2022, broadcast rights revenue was estimated at over $3 billion from a single tournament. Here's what makes this remarkable as a business model. FIFA doesn't own any teams. It doesn't pay the salaries of the players who drive viewership. The clubs do. The national associations do. FIFA collects the broadcast revenue and distributes a portion back down the chain, keeping the majority for operations, reserves, and development funding. It is arguably the most elegant revenue structure in global business. FIFA is the landlord of the world's most valuable real estate, and it has never once had to build anything on it. But underneath the glossy surface of broadcast deals and billion-dollar sponsorships, something darker had been running alongside the organization since the Havelange era. Horst Dassler had created ISL, International Sport and Leisure, as the marketing agency that brokered FIFA's commercial rights. It was a brilliant operation. ISL held the rights to sell FIFA's sponsorships and broadcast deals across multiple markets, taking a commission on everything it sold. But ISL was also making payments, quiet, undisclosed payments, to FIFA officials. Senior figures, including Havelange himself and his son-in-law Ricardo Teixeira, received millions in what Swiss courts later confirmed were bribes. The payments were framed as commissions or consultancy fees. They were routed through shell companies in offshore jurisdictions. They were designed to be invisible. When ISL collapsed into bankruptcy in 2001, owing creditors around $300 million, Swiss prosecutors began investigating. What they found was extraordinary, tens of millions of dollars in irregular payments, a paper trail connecting ISL's leadership directly to senior FIFA officials. But here's what happened next, and this is the moment that defines FIFA's entire modern history. Almost nothing was done. Swiss authorities allowed Havelange and Teixeira to avoid criminal charges in exchange for repaying a portion of the money under confidentiality agreements that kept the details secret for years. FIFA's ethics committee, which was supposedly investigating the matter, was chaired by a man complicit in the same culture. The corruption wasn't a breach of the system, it was the system. Which is what makes May 27th, 2015 so seismic. The United States Department of Justice didn't have obvious jurisdiction over FIFA, but it found one. The bribes had been routed through US banks. The wire fraud had touched American soil. And under the RICO statute, originally designed to prosecute organized crime, American prosecutors had everything they needed. Attorney General Loretta Lynch announced the indictments on the steps of the Justice Department. The charges spanned 2 decades. The alleged bribes totaled more than $150 million. Defendants included serving and former FIFA vice presidents, marketing executives, and broadcasters across multiple continents. The FBI's investigation, codenamed Beautiful Game in a piece of deliberate dark irony, had taken years. Informants had been flipped, bank records subpoenaed. The corruption that FIFA's own governance had protected for decades was dismantled by American prosecutors who had no political reason to protect anyone. Sepp Blatter initially survived the arrests. He was re-elected FIFA president just 3 days after the raids, a vote that had been scheduled before the crisis and proceeded anyway, with almost surreal momentum. But 4 days after his re-election, Blatter announced his resignation. Swiss authorities were investigating him for a suspicious payment of 2 million Swiss francs made to UEFA president Michel Platini, the man who had run FIFA for 17 years, who had presided over its greatest commercial expansion, and who had publicly declared his innocence at every turn, was gone. The organization that had positioned itself as the guardian of the beautiful game had turned out to be running the most sophisticated corruption machine in the history of international sport. And yet, the World Cup got more valuable. This is perhaps the most extraordinary fact in this entire story. The 2015 scandal, the arrests, the resignations, the FBI investigations, the replacement of Blatter with Gianni Infantino in 2016. None of it slowed the commercial momentum of the World Cup by a single dollar. Infantino didn't just rebuild FIFA's image, he expanded its ambitions. In 2017, he announced that the 2026 World Cup, hosted across the United States, Canada, and Mexico, would expand from 32 to 48 teams. Critics called it dilution of quality, a transparent revenue grab. Infantino called it inclusion. The financial reality was straightforward. More teams meant more matches meant more broadcast hours meant more advertising inventory meant more money for FIFA. The 2022 to 2026 World Cup cycle is projected to generate between $11 and $13 billion for FIFA, nearly double the revenue of the 2018 cycle. Broadcast rights for the 2026 tournament alone are expected to exceed $4 billion. FIFA's annual reports show reserves of over $2.5 billion, sitting in Swiss accounts, invested in financial markets, generating returns between tournaments. The organization that began as a committee of 7 European nations in a Paris office, that nearly collapsed in the 1920s, that survived bribery scandals, FBI raids, criminal investigations, and the resignation of its longest-serving president, has never been wealthier, never been more powerful, and never been more commercially dominant than it is right now. So we come back to where we started, a non-profit organization, $13 billion, zero income tax. The story of FIFA is not really a story about football. It's a story about the architecture of power, how ownership of a single event, locked in during a small tournament in Uruguay in 1930, can compound over decades into something that governments, broadcasters, and multinational corporations cannot negotiate around. It is a story about what happens when no meaningful external accountability exists, when an organization defines its own ethics committee, selects its own investigators, and operates across jurisdictions specifically chosen to make prosecution nearly impossible. But it is also, despite everything, a story about the genuine and irreducible power of human attention. 4 billion people watched the 2022 World Cup, not because FIFA told them to, not because Sepp Blatter or Gianni Infantino compelled them, because the sport itself is extraordinary. FIFA didn't create that, it captured it, and in doing so, it built one of the most durable, most profitable, and most controversial business empires the world has ever seen. The beautiful game, the ugly business, and somehow 13 billion reasons why it doesn't matter which one you focus on.